You're listening to the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, where we speak with founders, CEOs, investors, advisors, experts, and thought leaders in the brave new world of psychedelics and entheogenic medicines. Brought to you by Psychedelic Invest, bringing you unparalleled psychedelic investing data and analysis. Psychedelic Invest is the industry's leading resource for those looking to invest in the burgeoning psychedelic industry. For more information and to access all of the podcast episodes, check out our website at psychedelicinvest.com/podcast. And now, here's the host of the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Psychedelic Invest Podcast. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. Our guest today is Becca Williams. She is an emotions therapist. We're going to talk to her about the work she does with folks, helping them with process, with understanding, with awareness, and how she uses plant medicine of various sorts, and we'll get into that in a little bit, to help that process. I'm fascinated by this kind of the space, and I'm really excited for the conversation because I think a lot of what we're realizing in the psychedelic space is that it's more than the plant itself. It's a journey, it's a process, and how you go about that process, how you enter it, how you go through it, how you integrate it afterwards is a huge part of the impact it has. And having guides helping with this process is hugely important. And Becca is one of those guys. So we're going to talk to her about the work she does and the results, the impact that she has found using plant medicine and how we can learn from it and where kind of this industry is going. So with that, Becca, welcome to the program.
Bruce, thank you. And, I just want to say that I really admire what you're doing. You're covering this emerging landscape of psychedelics, and you've been doing amazing work in educating us about cannabis on all fronts, and now this embrace of psychedelics and all that entails. So thank you, and thank you for having me on to discuss how my work fits into tripping outside of the box.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And before we kind of dive into the work you're doing today, I'd love to kind of get a sense of background and the journey you've been on. I mean, what's the backstory? How did you get involved in plant medicine and cannabis and psychedelics? Give us a little bit of the background.
All very, very personal.
Yeah.
It started, I suppose it started as a child in a very, what do I want to say, a very complicated and challenging childhood with a mentally ill mother who self-medicated with alcohol and a father who was not in the picture. And it was often a very volatile and often dangerous situation. So therein I emerged with a lot of trauma, what they call developmental trauma from childhood. And so I wrestled a lot with a cocktail of emotions, and that's my area of specialty is emotions. And it's because I wanted to know what was going on with me. And I mostly wrestled with a lot of anxiety, and there was a lot of crippling self-doubt. Anger and sadness. And so growing up, I was very marginalized. I was made to believe that I really wasn't welcome here in both what people said and what people did. I was kind of a alien in my family, and everything they did made me feel that way. So it was an interesting direction that I went now that I have this emotions education behind me, and I realized that people can go two ways, and they actually with self-doubt, because as human beings we're all trying to gain approval and avoid rejection.
Sure.
And so for me, it was really very much so in spades about needing this acceptance. And so I went a different direction than curling up into a ball and just going numb. I expressed it in a highly functioning. I was a highly functioning trauma survivor, and so I it was always about trying to find that approval, that validation. And so I went to the highest levels to get it, and that was in television news. And so I studied journalism in university, and I loved to write, and it turned out that I was good at it and was a good reporter. But I was in television, so the idea that people would see me, and
Sure.
somewhere along the line, I was taught that that my family thought I wasn't very smart. My stepfather was very abusive in that way. His nickname for me was the big idiot. So you can imagine what was laid on me. And so moving in through high school, it came to my attention that I had some quote unquote pretty. And so I leveraged that. And, in television news, it's for women anyway. It's really about looking good. And so I studied journalism, and I went into television, starting out as Becky the weather girl way back when, with a very small television station where I was going to school in a small town in Minnesota, and then worked up from there into Chicago. But what happened was to be able to be on the air and just getting that feedback from the audience, where where you look good, or you're a good reporter, or you're a good writer, oh, you're smart. And the big deal is I was being fed this, but there were no internal resources, Bruce, none at all. And so it would just slip. It would just slip through, and I just had to constantly feed myself. And so I did that for years and years and years, and at the same time realizing how much I was hurting. And so I was constantly ongoing looking for ways to feel better, from years of talk therapy, and then I went the spiritual route. I mean, in our culture, it's either actually the psychology, the talk therapy, or doing something spiritually. And oh man, meditation. I studied meditation and through Buddhism and Kabbalah and TM. But when I sat down to do that quiet mindfulness meditation, I just couldn't do it. I had pounding, throbbing thoughts, or I dissociated.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
And so I was always looking for something. And in college, somebody turned me on to cannabis, and I felt better. I started to feel better, that the anxiety level would go down, particularly when I was by myself. I learned that I wasn't particularly good in groups passing a joint, but I'd feel better if I was by myself. And so I self-medicated all the way through into young adulthood and adulthood. Up until to not today, but what the problem with cannabis was that it was, while I was under the influence, it felt better, but once that wore off, the anxiety and everything else, the shame would come back and start haunting me again. So I just continued to look. I mean, it hurt, as a lot of people out there, and people who come to me just say, I know I have looked in so many different places for answers. So about 7 years ago, one thing led to another, and I found this work found me, called Emotional Liberation. And it was created and developed by a man who is my dear friend and colleague now. And I started doing this work because it was a totally different paradigm. It was about using your emotions as your inner guidance system, which was what? Because we don't talk about emotions other than sort of a generalized, generic reference to them. And so what this work does is split these emotions up into a palette of 7 different ones, where we're studying anxiety and anger and guilt and shame and depression and desire, which is very much like addictions and neediness, sadness and grief. And so what I started doing while I was doing this work, I was in a year-long program with this man who is a 40-year yoga master, hailing from the Kundalini tradition, and I can talk about that later. Yeah. But oh my God, it started working for me, and all the time I started microdosing with it. Now that was antithetical to the teacher's way, but I let him in on what I was doing, and I was the only one in about a group of 12 people doing it, and this was all online, and I was moving through this, the emotions and the trauma. It was just jaw-dropping for me. And so about halfway through of this, it was a 9-month program, I was realizing real healing. And so I went on to study with this teacher for 4 more years. He certified me in this work. I've included cannabis and now psilocybin microdosing in this whole program and with my students. And most of my students come to me based on including these plant medicine tools, and we're getting spectacular results. And that's how I got into it, because I hurt so badly. And so once the clouds parted and I started navigating calm-centered clarity, I dropped my TV work. I didn't want to, it just seemed like, it seemed irrelevant to me when I came out of this cloud that I'd been living in for most of my life and saw so many other people who were tormented by difficult emotions, that, hey, I'm going to teach this. So voila, here I am.
I'm curious, this whole kind of understanding our emotions and dealing with our emotions, I find fascinating. I mean, I think culturally we've got a lot of issues or a lot of patterns, philosophies, approaches to emotions that, I think can be problematic. But I think we're kind of trained or taught to not trust our emotions or to put our emotions aside, think very rationally. And I think, we've kind of created a culture and somewhat of, a couple of generations here of people that are at best not very good at understanding and listening to emotions, at worst are kind of at battle with their emotions.
Right.
I mean, how do you separate out the individual experiences that people have had and their individual emotions from kind of the general cultural, social kind of take on emotions and how we should listen to them or not listen to them or use them in our kind of day-to-day lives?
What a beautiful question. And where do I even begin to start? So for one, you said, a lot of people try to rationalize it out.
Yeah.
And rationale is the thinking mind. So we're trying to think it through. And what GM Khalsa, my then teacher, realized, because he's working the spiritual aspect, and we're talking about the science of meditation and pulling it from, all those holy men dwelling in caves thousands of years ago, and how to move the emotions through. We don't do it with our thinking mind. We do it intuitively. We have to learn. What I teach is to how to go inward, how to be in touch with our deep inner knowing. Because what he found, what's revolutionary about this work, is that our emotions form a bridge to our intuition, which in turn are tethered to our trauma. And so the $1,000,000 question is how to bring up the trauma, how to bring it up so that we can release it. And it's really a confounded Western science, but we're putting words to what we've been doing in Eastern wisdom and mysticism. And we know in Western science that trauma is lodged in our body. It's lodged in the tissues of our body, our nervous system, and how to get it out, how to get it up. Well, if we go to Eastern teachings, yogic science, we understand that there are blocks in our body, in our energetic system. We talk about the chakra system and the meridian points, and that there are blocks in that system and how to get them out. So in Eastern wisdom, we have energy blocks. In Western science, we have trauma. Same thing.
Okay.
Only in Eastern wisdom, we know what to do about it. And that's what I teach people to do. So now enter the plant medicine, and the plant medicine just accelerates everything. It opens us up. It relaxes us. It leans in and creates neuroplasticity. That's the ability of the brain to form and organize synaptic connections, to develop new patterns of thought and behavior. And guess what? They've found in research that meditation does the same thing. So when we put those two together, and first of all, we do a lot of work understanding the emotions. So we're plugging into the cognitive or the thinking brain. So we go in going, oh yeah, okay, there's these emotions, and this is in there. Each one has a signature personality, if you will. And then we know, because when we're just walking along and something or somebody comes out of left field and says or does something, or we have an errant thought and we are triggered and we are off to the races, and it just, this emotion comes up and just rolls over us like a tsunami, and we are flooded and we don't know what to think. We don't know what to say. Our thinking is thrown off. The way we see things are thrown off. And so we're just nuts because we're in what I call lizard brain. So what we do through this work in drawing from the Eastern practices is we start strengthening the frontal cortex. And so what we're doing well in the course of bringing up the prefrontal cortex, when we're bringing up the emotions, because we need to do that in order to move them through. We need to, as I say, meet them, greet them, and release them. But we can only do that when we strengthen our nervous system through these very expressive and active meditation workouts. My guys, a few courses back, we started talking about meditation and how hard when people say, oh, I got to do my meditation and sit down. A couple of the guys said, if we could liken it to a workout. So we've started calling it a neural workout, because that is what it is, right? And so we've referred to it as our neural workout, and we're toning and we're conditioning the nervous system. And once we start doing this with regularity, 11 minutes a day, only 11 minutes a day, we then start rewiring our brain. So we're moving this through.
Yeah. I'm curious, how much do you feel the plants are kind of quieting our rational mind or increasing the volume of our emotional, kind of connection? How do you think this is working, or how do you sense the plants help this process?
Yeah, important question. It's happening on both fronts. Okay. Because what we know now with the cannabis, we know the neuroplasticity kicks into gear, as well as with, I use psilocybin microdosing.
Yep.
And what we know from our studies with meditation, of course, but also with psychedelics, is that it lifts what we call the default mode network, or affectionately called the DFM, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what puts us kind of in a routine and keeps us captive to these difficult emotions. And so when we can lift the default mode network, we can be exposed to the beautiful emotions of joy and love and peace and all of that. And so at the same time, we are quieted down in order to do this work. We're made more relaxed and more spacious and open to bringing this up. So it really fires on both cylinders.
Yeah. And talk to me about this kind of mind-body connection on this stuff. I mean, how much do you feel, the trauma, the pattern is, in our physical body, right? It's ingrained in the way our nervous system works in our body, but it's also part of our mind, part of our thinking. I mean, what is the connection for you, or how do you see kind of the physical element versus the kind of the thinking element, or do you not see a difference? I mean, I'm curious to get your take on that. Yeah,
such important questions you ask. What we need to do is to go back to the mindfulness meditation. What we're finding is that just does not resonate for a lot of people. Yeah. It's very popular. It's the thing that's talked about, and
all the rage.
And that's the thing. When I started doing this years and years ago, it was like, well, everybody else can do it but me. Mm-hmm. And then there's, because I'd be sitting there dissociating and in my mind redecorating my living room, and everybody else is, apparently doing it and getting a lot out of it, and I couldn't do it. And so on top of not being able to do it was this feeling of shame.
Yeah, exactly.
So I doubled down on the emotional overwhelm in regard to that. So what happens is that, we're ruminating, we're dissociating, the pounding thoughts with the mind. And so the trauma's in our body. And so what we need to do, and what we do is with this very active meditation, is we engage the mind. So let me say that we in the neuro workouts, we use movement, sitting down. This is not yoga. Let me just be very clear. We're not doing yoga on a mat. We're sitting, and it's very active from the waist up, if you will. So we're doing movements with the body. We are making sounds like mantras, because those cause a vibrational tone that further engages the energy and stirs it up. And very important is the breath work. So we're doing deep, what do I want to say? We really change it up with the breath work. So it's not long, deep breathing, although that is a very important aspect of it. But we will be doing all sorts of things like counting. So what this does is it tricks the mind.
Yeah.
It keeps the mind. It says, mind, come here. What I want you to do is I want you to do the breath work, and I want you to count to 4 on the inhale, and I want you to hold for 8 on the, just hold. And then on the exhale, I want you to do it in 4 breaths. So you have to count this out. The mind has to count this out. And then, oh, by the way, there's a mudra, which is a hand position that is energetically correlated to our meridian points. And in my playground of Hinduism, it's called the nadis, the nadi system, Nadi. And then we also oftentimes do a mantra. So the mind is saying, we're going, honey, I want you to go over here and I want you to take care of all these things. All right. I want you to be on top of all these things. Yeah, exactly. And then while we're doing that, we're engaging the body, and we're inviting whatever is knocking loudest on our head. And that may be anxiety. And what are we anxious about? Emotion brings up thoughts and memories. And another piece around the mindfulness meditation or the guided meditation. I mean, I remember this, I don't do that anymore, but, years and years, it's like, walking beside the lake or on the beach, and you have big fluffy clouds, and you're imagining, you're a bird, and I could never do that stuff. But if somebody said to me, all that stuff you've been ruminating about and worrying about, just bring it up, okay? I'm gonna talk you through this. I'm gonna invite you to bring this stuff up, and it's like, oh yeah, I can do that. Because it's on my head anyway. So those emotions are tethered to our trauma, and so when we start bringing those emotions up, we're in touch with the trauma and it's moving through. Now, Bruce, I have to say that this is simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of things you brought up there, which I think, it took me a while to kind of learn, but I think they're important learning, is this whole, our mind controls our body. Well, in fact, our body can control our mind a lot more. So the whole idea of the breath work and the movements and stuff is being, if you can get your body to do certain things, or you engage your body in certain ways, it actually changes your thinking, right? It starts changing your parasympathetic nervous system, right? That starts changing the thought pattern structure that you have, right? So I certainly have learned to appreciate, a lot of this work is to kind of prime or to change the patterns in your thinking that's going on, so that you can start to engage and hopefully address some of these underlying issues that have been blocked by your thinking patterns up to date.
We're creating new neural networks. Yeah, that's right, because we've been defaulting to these neural networks that are all about being anxious or angry or sad or depressed. Right. And so what we do is we dry those up and they blow away, speaking very casually here about this so everybody can understand it, and creating new ones where we default to feeling good about ourselves, feeling a sense of joy.
So this process allows you to tap into the emotions, which then lets you kind of get to the underlying trauma. I guess, how do you help folks sort of navigate that process? Because I can imagine that could be pretty intense, particularly if you've had intense trauma and you've got intense emotionals, that could be potentially overwhelming. I mean, how do you help people with the actual, now that I've got access to these emotions and to this trauma, actually processing them?
Yeah. Oh, excellent questions, Bruce. Thank you. So it can be overwhelming. So let's understand that we all have trauma to a lesser or greater degree. It can be a greater degree, like I explained about me. But it might be where someone had great parenting and the parents were there, they did all the right things. And, then as a baby or as a child, you needed one of those parents right there and then, and the parents were busy. Maybe there was an emergency and they couldn't get to you and they, weren't there, and you just lie there and you cry and you suffer and whatever. And so, and you're afraid, and maybe it's in the dark or whatever. Nobody's coming to you. And that can be a one-off. That can be, and for a sensitive, and we're all sensitive children when we're small like that, but that can be egregiously trauma-inducing. And then, maybe everything's going fine except there's a bully in the playground who corners us from time to time and scares the bejesus out of us. Mm-hmm. And so, and going to war and, or being mugged, one-off. So we're everywhere on the spectrum. And so some people have the trauma that's closer to the surface. It's just there waiting, and it's overwhelming because, and you use the word overwhelming, and that's a good description.
The thing I find about overwhelming, it describes this state where I do not have tools or framework or a mode to process what's happening to me, right? And so that overwhelming sense is kind of like, I don't know what to do because I don't know how to process things.
And it can scare you. Thank you for that. Yeah. And so when we start calling the stuff up, because we're so busy pushing the emotions away and not feeling the feeling, because it feels so awful that when we start doing it, when we start inviting them up and they've never been invited up before, they're like this person you've not paid a lot of attention to, and they come back in and go, yeah, I'm here. I want to be here. I want to, look at me, look at me, look at me. And it can be overwhelming because along with those emotions comes that pain. And we understand from research that the pain of difficult emotions is just as torturous as physical pain. So this is what we call self-therapy. My work is self-therapy. I teach you to guide yourself through this so that you're not relying on me to go, oh, too much. You're going, oh, wait a minute, there's too much coming up. So I need to back down and I need to just fall into long, deep breathing and get everything in place and just move very slowly. So along that spectrum, it can be someone who really needs to be, maybe it's just a box breath at the beginning, an inhale of 4, a hold of 4, an exhale of 4, a hold out of 4. And just very gentle until we start toning that nervous system. And then we go a little more and a little more. On the other hand, there are those who go in and just wade in real fast